Okay, class, we have here an exercise video for Chapter 3, Lesson 5, and we're just going to look at what they're asking for. I'm not going to do many of these problems simply because this is basic multiplication. What you're really trying to understand is how to handle the positives and negatives, which I think is simple enough to apply. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of these, but I will just show you, for instance, number 4, they ask us to use repeated addition to show that each of the following equations are true. So we have 3 times 4 is equal to 12. So 3 times 4 is equal to 12. Well, that would be 3 times 4. So we have 4 plus 4 plus 4, right? 3 times 4. 1, 2, 3. And if you add 4 plus 4 plus 4, the answer would be 12. Okay? You could do the same thing here for negative numbers, adding negatives. So let's move on. Number 5, find each of the following products. Here, again, just make sure you understand that positive times positive is positive and negative times negative is positive. And of course, if it's negative and positive or positive and negative, then the answer would be negative. Okay, let's see. Continuing with number 6, the result of multiplying any number by 1 is the same number. Okay, copy and complete the table copy and complete this table showing the result of multiplying numbers by -1. So you've done this before, just a simple math. Again, positives and negatives. Make sure you apply what you've learned, and you can answer the questions. You're going to be challenged here to simply answer the questions that are related to this very basic positive and negative multiplication rule that you've learned. Okay. Number 7, we just simply need to find the number that corresponds to the to the box. So instead of just finding an answer, sometimes, well, in other words, finding what something is multiplying and what it equals to, you need to find something that you're multiplying by to get the answer. So you could see like letter C and letter D. Well, what would you multiply by 4 to get 40? What would you multiply by 4 to get -40? So there are two different answers there. Now, in number 8, you're going to see multiple multiplication or multiple numbers being not just 2. And just remember that when you multiply 2 together, you get a result. Then you're multiplying it by something else. So don't be confused here with the positives and negatives. Just keep following the rule. When you multiply a negative times a positive, it will yield a certain result. You might say, well, I have 3 negatives here. Well, just multiply. For instance, let's see, letter D. Letter D, we have -3 times -5 times -7. Well, -3, I'm going to put parentheses around it. You didn't need to because it's at the beginning, but just to keep things nice and consistent and to further teach you how to use these parentheses when you have negatives in particular, we'll just write it in. So what do you get when you multiply -3 times -5? Well, that would yield positive 15. Okay, because a negative times a negative is a positive, and 3 times 5 is 15. But now I'm going to multiply that times -7. So now I have a positive and a negative, and I'll tell you right now that my answer is going to be negative. The question is what? Well, 7 times 5 is 35. Carry the 3. 7 times 1 is 7 plus 3. So the answer is -105. So you could see where we have a negative times a negative times a negative. Now, we're not going to get rules here. Well, if a negative times a negative times a negative times a positive times a negative, there aren't rules for this. You just simply follow the basic rule when you multiply 2 together. And that's what we did here. Now we could have multiplied it the other way. We could have multiplied -3 times -5 times -7 would have given me positive 35, right? We would have multiplied these two first. Then we would have had -3 times 35. Again, same result. negative 3 times 35 would yield negative 3 times positive 35 would yield a negative, and that would have been 105. Okay, the same. So no matter which way you would have multiplied, you would have gotten the answer. So you just have to keep applying the rule each time you're multiplying two numbers until you get to your final number. Now we have number 9 is going to test your ability to see if it's greater than, less than, or equal to. And in some of these, I would just tell you that you probably don't even have to do the multiplication, though you probably will, and it's okay. Remember that the greater negative is less than the lesser negative. So in the first one, we have negative 1. Okay, and again, I'm just going to put the parentheses. And then we have negative 9, or excuse me, negative 1 times positive 9. Okay, now when we do the math here, we would have negative 10, right? Negative 1 times 10 would make it negative 10. Negative 1 times 9 would be negative 9. And remember that negative 9 is actually greater than, or excuse me, negative 10, reading it across the way we should, negative 10 is less than negative 9. Okay, because we would look at it from the number line perspective, and we know that negative 10 is to the left of negative 9. But again, you will be able to look at some of these and determine if your answer is going to be positive or negative. You'll probably have to do the math all the way through just to get to your answer. But I can just look at E, just right, and I'll give you a shortcut view at some of this, and this will build itself further on in math. But I see negative 9 times negative 8 times negative 7. And then I have, I didn't give myself quite enough room here. Okay, so let me just, let me write it over here underneath. Negative 6, negative 5, negative 4, and negative 3. So we're multiplying these, and I could tell you that I don't even have to multiply these to know which one's greater or less than, because here I have 3 values that are being multiplied. They're all negative, and here I have 4 values. Well, what's going to happen when I multiply these two? I'm going to get a positive. Am I not, right? Like we did over here. Negative 3 times negative 5. And then when I multiply it by negative 7, it'll be a negative and a positive. My answer here will always be negative, regardless of what these numbers are. My numbers will come out negative. But notice what happens here. When I multiply these two, I end up with a positive. And I could just take a quick shortcut and multiply these two and have a positive, right? And then I say positive, positive will be a positive. Or I could have just taken the long way and just say, okay, I'm going to keep multiplying my numbers across and say, well, I had a negative and a negative as a positive. Now I'm going to multiply it by a negative that would yield a negative number, right? And then I multiply it by a negative here. Negative times negative, my answer would have been positive. Now, knowing that this answer is positive and knowing that this answer is negative, without knowing what the numbers are, I already know that this is going to be less than, just by looking at the positive and negative. Now you can do the math. I suggest you do the math, but you really need to pick up on the fact that these guys here are going to always be positive, because it's negative and a negative make a positive, and these two negatives, so I turn 4 negatives into 2 positives, and my answer is going to be positive. So that was a little shortcut there. In 10, we're asked to just put in the values for x and y and to perform the function. Okay, so we find the values, and here we have an exercise in number 11 about raising a negative integer in powers. And again, this is a little bit related to this, when you're going to notice that there's going to be a certain behavior with odd integers and even integers. And again, I just made reference here that there were 3. These are odd, 3 negatives, and I have 4 negatives here. Notice that the odd always yielded a negative, and that the even yielded a positive, okay? And I showed you why. So you just go ahead and do your exercises. If you have any questions, then you can certainly send me an email.